you very much. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. I'm
doing a lot of the conference online. My voice is also a bit dodgy today, so please bear with me. I was asked to talk about the socio-economic impacts of APs in the context of greening policies in Europe, the Green Deal. Thank you very much for asking a Brit to talk about European policies. I wish we were still more involved with that general policy direction. What I thought I would do is really focus on some of the issues associated with the greening policy direction of travel. And because we've had so many detailed examples of how food systems work to incorporate sustainability, health, socioeconomic impact, I would take a broader look at all of this within the context of policies aiming to green. Having said which, I'll just recap in relation to the EU Green Deal. It aims to be a global standard in terms of safety, security of supply, nutrition and quality. And I certainly, for one, think it's getting there as the lead in this area. The goals are to ensure food security in the face of climate change, biodiversity loss, reduce the environmental and climate footprint of the EU food system, strengthen the EU food system's resilience, and lead the global transition towards competitive sustainability from farm to fork. And we can see that different parts of the world, we've just heard about APEC, are leading in some components of this global strategy. It's a little bit uncertain as to how climate change will be considered, for example, in relation to geopolitical shifts. So that's still an open book. I also have a big interest in policy conflict. One conflict that we might see emerging more is environmental conservation versus food availability. And also, if we look at cultural issues, food preferences versus environmental impacts. And we've heard that there are global inequalities. We're asking countries that bear the burden of food insecurity to reduce their national greenhouse gas emissions at a time when they're also fighting to make sure that they have enough calories, enough nutrition available to feed their populations. So here's some UK data. What's the challenge for land use policy towards net zero? We can see that certainly in the UK, and I feel a little bit more critical about the UK in terms of how they're moving in this transition, that we've actually flattened out. If we look at land-based emissions and removals by subsector as a share of the UK total, we're not making progress. I think partly that this is because we've failed, and this is the main point of the talk here, I guess, to integrate socio-economic, financial, cultural, historical, and legal factors into our understanding of food systems. One element that we often fail to consider are the cultural values of landscapes. That those cultural ecosystem services, which, if you like, are the fourth component of the primary ecosystem services that we consider in our modelling. We've heard already that we need stakeholder buy-in to adopt and implement new practices. We've heard about social life cycle assessment. Again, I would say that that often runs separate within the food system to some of the natural science and even the economic drivers that are linked to dietary transformation. Thinking about alternative proteins within the food system, within Europe and beyond, from food production to consumption, it's an interacting set of environmental, societal, cultural, political, and economic influences. And we need to consider both the factors pushing change, but also pulling within the food system. I think we need to address cultural and socio-economic feedback mechanisms, as well as some of the more, I suppose, sustainability related systems within the natural science domain. And I think, importantly, we need to consider the lock-in to specific practices, which may be reinforced by policies or by kind of cultural traditions. So I've gone back to the 18th century. This is a painting by an anonymous artist depicting the rural idyll. And this is what people in the city wanted their countryside to look like. Simple, rather perfect, beautiful countryside, but clearly a simplicity which led to rural happiness. This is a cultural ecosystem service. It wouldn't have been named as such when it was painted, for example. I'd like to propose that actually we still think of the countryside from an urban perspective as delivering a rural idyll which no longer exists. If we think, we've heard a lot about how animal production systems contribute to GHG emissions. We need to reduce our reliance on these systems. Alternative proteins are an important part of the transition towards net zero under greening policy transition. We've heard a lot about consumer preferences and choices, but I think there are other factors that we need to consider as part of the social life cycle assessment, but also as part of the broader picture. Impacts on rural economies and reskilling. We need to think more about the acceptability of environmentally friendly practices such as land sharing and sparing, as opposed to land abandonment. And one of the issues, I think, is that as we transition away from livestock production, land abandonment, where land is unmanaged, is going to become more of a problem. And it's certainly already a problem within Europe, within the UK, and with other countries in the region. We're thinking about the impacts of biodiversity in relation to pasture and ensuring that we actually hit a sweet spot between the different delivery of different ecosystem services. This may militate against increased intensification, but perhaps we don't want to remove all of our permanent grasslands because of the biodiversity which it supports, but also the cultural ecosystem services which are linked to it. If we develop further, if we capitalize on the circular bioeconomy in relation to farm biomass and integrating bioreactors and farm diversification, we're also going to intrinsically change the character of our rural communities, and again, the way the landscape looks. And then finally, I suppose we need to integrate consumer decision making from the perspective of what's driving their preferences, which may not necessarily be related to sustainability. So I thought I'd look in detail, have a deep dive into permanent grasslands and ecosystem services. Whoops. So obviously, these grasslands, the Dehesa in Spain, for example, some of the alpine regions in Germany, the UK, the upland areas, we're supporting a whole range of different ecosystem services, biodiversity, regulating and supporting functions in relation to flood control, for example, but also productivism, producing food. Importantly, for many urban populations, the cultural ecosystem services which are delivered by these landscapes are an important priority. At the same time, for example, in the UK and in some parts of Europe in general, there's a general trend towards intensification, having more animals, increasing stocking rates, and these grasslands. Looking at England and Wales, from the 1930s to the 1980s, 97% of lowland wildflower meadows were lost. And in the UK, species grasslands cover less than 1% of the UK land area. So it's a disappearing resource. Here's some data from some modelling reported by colleagues in 2022 looking at multifunctionality across Europe. This study involved data from 3 EU countries, Spain, the Netherlands, and Slovenia, plus the UK and Switzerland. And what we can see, if we look at the provision of productivist ecosystem services, as you intensify, these would increase. At the same time, there's a decrease in environment and biodiversity. If you wanted to optimize environmental and biodiversity related ecosystem services, you'd need to maximize extensification of stocking rates on these grasslands. You can see from this that actually just intensifying a little bit will deliver the optimum ecosystem service delivery. If you wanted to deliver all 3 of those ecosystem services, there's a midpoint between extensification and intensification. I think the point here would be that if we replace some of that livestock with the alternative proteins, that will certainly result in an improvement in the environment and biodiversity elements of ecosystem services, which would align with requirements, I suppose, in relation to greening. If we go again back to look at the percentage of gross farm income, however, we can see that policy has actually been a driver up until CAP reform of maintaining farming practices in relation to livestock. So this is a reanalysis of FADN data. And you can see that for farms in the Czech Republic and to some extent in Sweden, the reliance on basic payments and GFI as RDP payments was almost 100%. Even across the other countries sampled, the reliance on these payments has been very, very high. So the shift from basic payments to agri-environment schemes may be financially problematic. The analysis has suggested that there are problems with applications of EU-wide instruments to a very heterogeneous biographic zones and socio-cultural contexts. Some of the barriers to change in mountainous areas would be different to those on lowland areas, for example. It's been suggested that more targeted agri-environment schemes might be more acceptable to and effective in encouraging a balance between food production and other agri-environmental schemes. Normally, but not always, farmers are more likely to adopt the economically viable options, which may not deliver environmental outcomes. Some targeted actions are moved into Pillar 1 in the future CAP that's being enforced now. But there is a need for farmer involvement and peer support in shaping policy and economic support to deliver change. And I think increasing the supply and the acceptability of alternative proteins may help this transition away from livestock production. Although there are other issues related to policy. So first of all, we know that farmers require financial incentives and technical guidance to trigger positive tipping points to make a change in their farming practices away from livestock, for example, towards payment for environmental benefits. So changes to agri-environmental schemes and subsidy programs are needed to deliver more ecosystem services from pasture land. Land use and management change should be appropriate, context-specific, and align with farming values. Flexibility in payments, including payment stacking and assessment metrics, is also really, really important. I think there's a key problem linked to many agri-environmental schemes, and that you can make change, but you can't always guarantee that the environmental transition or change that you're looking for will occur. So we need to be making payments for changes which need to be localized in the context of the farm that we're thinking about. We can try and look at leverage in preventing land abandonment and reducing stocking density as a policy transition, but we also need to make sure that these farms are financially viable. Farmer values are also important. We have a body of work that suggests that many farmers have a productivist identity. They see themselves as producers of food. They don't see themselves as producers of environmental goods. So both the financial and non-financial impacts of policies and interventions on farmers need to be considered before policy-based interventions are enacted in relation to rural transitions. If we're replacing livestock with alternative proteins, we need to consider those environmental contexts. Consumer sustainability and animal welfare. Again, this is the results of a pan-national survey, including countries outside of Europe. We found that consumers are very similar in how they made decisions about sustainability and animal welfare. One issue is that they consider animal welfare as a sustainability attribute. even though I think most scientists or natural scientists would not consider that as a component of sustainability. So alternative proteins might be better positioned as a fresh pro-animal welfare product rather than as a sustainability promoting product. Another issue that's come up from research is in relation to insect proteins. And I'm just putting this out here as a possible problem, that although most consumers find it acceptable to feed animals insect-derived proteins, perhaps less acceptable as a food for humans, does this result in actually a perception that we're being more sustainable, which will result in turn in an increase in animal production? Some more about differences in consumer perceptions of what's acceptable. In Spain and Sweden, we found that in this particular study, again, a survey study across multiple countries, that there was much higher food involvement and perhaps less acceptance of non-traditional products for some consumers, whereas health and sustainability involved consumers would probably be those that are most accepting of alternative proteins. So one communication mechanism is not going to affect all. If we move to the Czech Republic and Switzerland, these consumers were more price sensitive and less involved in food. So here, it would probably be important to make sure that alternative proteins are priced to be cheaper than animal-based products. You can see that there's less concern about the environment for these consumers. Here's some work I think might be relevant to introducing alternative proteins. This is work in progress, where we're trying to, if you like, nudge the public on the demand side to make decisions simultaneously considering the environmental and the nutritional impact of food. Very quickly, because I'm conscious of the time, consumers are making decisions based on the short-term nutritional gains made by choosing a product, and not from the environmental impact of food. We've tried to combine LCA scores here with nutritional scores. So the environmental LCA scores, I have to say, it's a little bit of the Wild West. Again, there's a consumer preference for making decisions based on animal welfare rather than environmental impact. But generally, people are appreciating having that information available in a quick and easy form, which can be used to make a decision either on a menu or on a food product in a retail environment. So, from the demand side of the system, it's important to emphasize health and sustainability in some countries, but not all of them. Emphasize animal welfare benefits generally. Try to keep costs low, especially compared to equivalent animal products, and that may be really important for consumers who are price sensitive. I think there's a really complex debate to be had about subsidies and taxation. Should we subsidize alternative proteins? How would you calculate that to be operationalized as part of the food system? I had a quick look at some of the social media promotion of the healthiness of alternative proteins, the advantages, the disadvantages. There's a huge debate at the moment about actually we should be avoiding them because they're ultra processed. I would say actually we should be worrying about high salt, sugar, and fat levels in food rather than the fact that things are ultra processed. But nonetheless, there's a move away from some of these foods because of this perception that ultra processed foods are bad for you. Barriers to adoption, the ultra processing debate, but also unnaturalness, cost, and this is important, the disruption of traditional landscapes through land use change. I thought I'd have some fun and go out and create some images using AI. Here we have a farm of the future powered by biomass. So we have the bioreactors. I don't think that people really see this as the future of farming. They're still quite locked into the rural idyll of a few years ago in the 18th century. I would say that alternative proteins in the food system, we have lock-ins to animal production that might be partly a policy issue. Referring back to basic payments under the unreformed cap, but also resistance to new agri-environment schemes. So we want, on the push side, to continue to produce livestock. Citizen preferences for farmed and tidy landscapes, and the farmer productivist identity. Farmers see themselves as the guardians of European food security. From the policy push side, the acceptability of co-produced agri-environment schemes.
I can. That she can.
Subsidies for alternative protein production, on-farm bioreactors powered by biomass. There's a lot of discussion about how this might be operationalized, but it requires buy-in from rural residents, but also changes in the skills needed in the countryside. Consumer pull, health, animal welfare. I'm less sure about sustainability. That's just the references that I've used to create this presentation. And thank you for your attention. Some more fun with AI imaging, the farm of the future, the bioreactor, and the kitchen table.